The Forum at 8 with Xolani Gwala.
It is now 10 minutes after 8. A very good morning indeed, and a warm welcome to the Forum at 8 here on SAFM, South Africa's news and information leader. Well, this morning we're talking about salt content in our food. The Department of Health wants us, South Africans, to reduce by half our salt intake. The government wants South Africans to meet the World Health Organization's target of eating just 5 grams of salt a day, which means halving what we currently consume. They are targeting salt as they say it is regarded as one of the biggest contributors to illnesses such as hypertension. The department also saying that about 60% of the salt consumed by South Africans comes from processed food. Now this morning, we would like to discuss these matters further because some people have taken the suggestion by the department with a pinch of salt, so to speak. Right then, let me welcome my guest who will make sense of why we need to do this and how much salt is too much salt. My guest on the program, starting with Professor Melvin Freeman. He's the Chief Director for Non-Communicable Diseases at the Department of Health. Professor Freeman, good morning.
Morning, and morning to your listeners.
And thank you very much. Also joining us on our lines, Erica Katterer, Head of the Research and Program Development at the Department or at the Heart and Stroke Foundation. Good morning to you, Erica.
Morning, Xolani. Thanks very much for having me on
Much
the show. And morning
appreciated.
to the listeners.
Thanks indeed. Here with me in the studio, Precious Ngayana, independent pharmacist and a wellness campaigner. Good morning to you, Precious.
Good morning, Xolani listeners.
Thank you very much. Let me start with you, Precious, because I was amazed at the emails that you sent me, that you've been campaigning on or against the issue of salt for quite a while in this country. Why?
No, I mean, when you look at the developed countries like the UK, I mean, they have been reducing the salt content for quite some time, and they have seen the results that by reducing the amount of salt that you take, you know, you actually improve the health of the people. But in the UK, if you look at how their strategy is, it's not just the salt, it's holistic. It is salt plus encouraging the whole population to eat as much natural foods like vegetables and fruits, you know, on a daily basis. So it's not just one thing. It's a holistic approach, because reducing salt alone, you know, I mean, it will only help only a certain percentage of the population, but not everyone.
All right, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the holistic approach in a moment. But clearly, reading your emails, it appears as if you are convinced that the level of salt that we take in this country is much, much higher than anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I am, because the way I cook at home, because I don't eat a lot of takeaways, you know, I don't use a lot of salt. So when it happens that I buy something out, like, for instance, when I used to eat meat, you know, whenever I went out, maybe bought some chicken from, you know, maybe Woolworths, that's the shop I used to have a problem with most of the time. When I eat, I'll buy their free range. So, but when I ate it, it was just too salty. And for me, I was paying extra so that I could get good quality meat, but I couldn't eat it because it was just too salty. And I would write to the company. All they did was just send me vouchers, which I never redeemed, because I say, you know, I don't want a voucher. I want you to go back and fix the problem, because the next time I buy a chicken, it has to be healthy for me. It has to be palatable for me to eat. But I don't know, because I just stopped eating meat altogether.
Simply because it was too salty?
Yeah, there were so many things that were just wrong with the foods that we... it's not the foods that I needed on a daily basis. Like buying a whole chicken was like, okay, once you buy it, you must finish it. So I don't need that much chicken. Why bother?
Gee. All right, let me bring in Professor Freeman. Where does the department come in here? At what point does the department think that, well, wait a minute, we should actually address the issue of our salt intake in this country?
Well, we have been aware for many years that salt is bad for health. But recently there has been a major focus worldwide on the prevention and control of what we call non-communicable diseases. And we include in that things like heart disease and strokes and so on. And there was a United Nations high-level meeting last year where all countries of the world committed to reducing the incidence of non-communicable diseases. And I think that galvanized us to say, well, we've been talking about it for a long time. We've been negotiating around it. Let's actually act on it. So we looked at our figures, we looked at the extent of the hypertension, we looked at the extent of salt as a cause of the hypertension, and we said, well, this is, as you said the other day, low-hanging fruit. And we can really make a difference to people's lives. We can save lives. We can save healthcare costs just by reducing salt in processed foods.
Talk about our figures, though. How bad are we as South Africans when it comes to salt intake?
Well, I'm not sure that I necessarily agree that we are amongst the worst in the world. We don't really know that. And I think we're probably equivalent to many other developing countries. And developed countries are also pretty bad because as we move to greater urbanization and greater industrialization and so on, people are eating more and more processed food, and they're putting more salt in it, and they're preserving foods for longer periods by putting more salt in it. So I think around the globe, we're actually having this increase in salt. So it doesn't mean to say that that's any less reason for us to act, because the amount of salt that we eat is probably double the amount that we need. So it doesn't matter if we're the highest or the lowest. We all, as a world, need to reduce our salt content. And South Africa is committed to doing that, and we want to be amongst the forefront, the countries leading this process.
Erica, are we on the right track here? What do you think about this campaign then started by the Department of Health?
Yeah, definitely. We, the Heart and Stroke Foundation, definitely supports the initiative. Reducing salt is majorly cost-effective intervention for public health, because reducing salt intake can reduce heart attacks and strokes, and it can reduce the burden on already overburdened healthcare system. And there are many countries around the world, like the UK, like Japan, like Finland, who've reduced sodium in processed foods, either voluntarily or by legislation, and it's shown to help to prevent cardiovascular disease. And it's been shown to be a much more cost-effective strategy than individual dietary changes. So it has major public health implications.
That's interesting. But let me read you this SMS. And, you know, even the last time I spoke to Professor Freeman, I got a lot of people responding and suggesting that perhaps we need to look at the facts about how salt affects people's diet. There's one from William in Cape Town, for instance, here, Erica, and I'm going to ask the professor to respond to this as well, who says having more salt in their diet is essential for people with low blood pressure, which can be just as dangerous as high blood pressure.
Yeah, I think one needs to be careful with making that recommendation in general, because yes, maybe it can help you in the short term, because in general what salt does, it'll make you thirsty, it's going to make you drink more water, and that's going to help to bring the blood pressure up. But, you know, giving that recommendation in general to people who have got low blood pressure over the long term, when you keep on taking in lots of salt, and as you age, your blood pressure goes up anyway. So I would be very careful to give that as a general recommendation to people who have low blood pressure. I would rather advise that they follow a general healthy diet and that they drink enough fluids.
Professor Freeman?
Yes, I don't think that our problem in terms of deaths and illness is really from low blood pressure. It's from high blood pressure. And if I can just maybe read you a couple of statistics that I have in front of me here. Looking at men, in the 35 to 44 year category, it's about 42% of our population have high blood pressure. Now, this is an increase from only about 10 years previously, where it was 22%. The 45 to 54-year-olds, 60%, up from 39%. 55 to 64, 70%, up from 52%. Let me move to women. 35 to 44, 34%, up from 24%. 45 to 54, 50%, up from 38%. And so on and so on. So we've got a real problem around hypertension.
Sure.
And I think that it's deaths from cardiovascular diseases are increasing at a rapid rate, and we also, as one of the previous speakers said, we're actually having additional unnecessary healthcare costs because people are not preventing the diseases from occurring in the first place. And I think that very often we rely on individuals to change behavior in order to prevent illness. And that's a very good thing, and we must continue to do that. But it's also possible for us to introduce measures that actually don't involve individuals having to change their own behaviors, which we know is difficult to do. And we can bring down or prevent illness and death but just by doing that. And people don't even necessarily have to know that this is happening in terms of the taste to their food. If we do it in a way that reduces the salt content quite slowly, people get used to it very quickly, and they prolonging their lives.
Professor, I think you're alluding to this somehow, but there's a point that was raised a little earlier on by Precious here with me in the studio about a holistic approach to this, as opposed to dealing with matters, I suppose, individually. Now we're talking about the salt content, as opposed to just holistically deal with healthy living.
Of course, we have to deal with healthy living, and the Department of Health is going to be embarking on more concerted efforts in that direction. And certainly from a pure salt point of view, we have to get people to reduce the salt that they put onto their foods very substantially. I think we all see people taking the salt cellars and pouring the salt on, and that needs to change. And we will, together with the Heart and Stroke Foundation, be launching public campaigns to try and encourage people to reduce what they put onto salt. And really, I want to also use this opportunity to encourage people to start slowly or quickly, but probably slowly because of the taste, reducing the salt in their food. But at the same time, if you say, I will reduce the salt in my food, but on my food, but the salt in the food is so high, then you don't have an option in that, as your guest was saying. Sure. So what we need to do is to both change what people do and change the content of the food, which people don't have control over. And in that way, we win.
I'll ask you in a minute to tell us about where is the most salt, Professor Freeman. But let me come back to Precious here with me. Do you think that the department, the country as such, is dealing with this matter holistically enough, or are we nitpicking, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, like you read my emails. I mean, I've been doing this for at least the past 3 years, where I was just focusing on salt. After applying my mind to say, okay, what is it that the nation or the world needs in order for people to live healthy lives, to address all other illnesses other than just one a disease, which is hypertension. When you look at where most salt is found, I mean, it's highly processed foods. I mean, do we really need processed foods? The bread has the highest amount of salt, and they're followed by things like milk, and people have milk every day, and bacon. So that's like, it's the stuff that they have every day, but is it necessary? Can they live? If you took all those from people, will they say, now we can't live because we don't have bread every morning, or we don't have a glass of milk every morning? When you look at the amount of salt, where it comes from, the bulk is from processed food. The salt that we add to our foods or we use at home is less than 25%, and the other 25% comes from the natural foods. So for me, the government, if they put the same amount of resources they are putting into regulating just salt alone, into coming up with a program that will actually teach people to say, you must eat your vegetables every day. You shouldn't eat as much processed foods, especially processed meats and things like that every day. So that will have more impact in improving the conditions of our people, not only hypertension. I mean, if people just stop eating salt and ate everything else, they will still gain weight. They will still be predisposed to diabetes because of obesity, heart diseases, stroke, so many other diseases, and cancer, because cancer is linked to highly processed foods. So salt alone, it's fine. They can do that, but thinking or considering that we have limited resources, if the resources they have now, they just carefully thought about them, how can we utilize them effectively so that the whole nation benefits, it would be much better.
All right. I'll open the lines, by the way. 089, Prof, I'm going to come to you in a second. 0891 104 208, 0891 104 208. And perhaps before you respond, Prof, let me read this email, which I suppose also touches on exactly some of the things that Precious has touched on. It comes from Mzamo in Orlando, in Soweto. It says, processed food in general should be the focus, because from these foods you get preservatives, salt, and saturated fat. It is a huge challenge, and it has has deep roots in our community as we consume processed foods as early as preschool. For example, amagwinya, fat cook, fish and chips, Russians, Vienna, polony, etc. Processed foods are cheap and easily accessible, especially now with the advent of shopping malls in the low-income areas. We should attack the problem of processed foods in general. That's Mzamo in Orlando. How do you respond then, Prof?
Yes, I absolutely agree that we need to have a holistic approach. And in fact, we've identified 4 main areas for prevention of non-communicable diseases. The one is smoking, the second one is alcohol abuse, the third one is lack of exercise, and the fourth one is diet. And diet is a complex issue, not just focusing on salt, of course. It's a whole issue of fats and amounts of what people eat and the costs and so on. So, yes, we are looking at all of those issues, but that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't also be talking about salt. And I think that what Precious was saying is if we used equal resources on some of those things as we're using on salt, then we would make better progress. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the resource that is needed to reduce salt is very, very little. You know, you hardly need major campaigns even, although that is also important. But in terms of the processed side of things, you don't even need that. You can actually reduce the intake just by getting companies to reduce the amount of salt. And you can have big wins with actually very little resources.
And well, unfortunately, Prof, though, the companies are balking at that because they're saying it's going to be too costly for them to, I suppose, come up with new methods of making bread, for instance.
Yeah, we have heard that. But we have been working with colleagues around the world in terms of what is needed. And we think it's probably easier than some of the people are actually suggesting. The other thing is that we met with industry a number of times prior to bringing out these regulations. And originally we had said that our deadlines for meeting these targets would be 2014 and 2016. They then said, look, we're going to need time to readapt to the process, to the process, and it's going to take longer. So we said, all right, well, we'll compromise also. We'll shift our dates to 2016 and 2018 and give you the chance to bring in the necessary process changes that are needed. And we think that within 4 years and within 6 years, it should be relatively easy for them to do that and hopefully for them to absorb the cost and not pass it on to consumers.
I'll open the lines. A couple of people have called 0891 104 208. Send me an email as well, gwala@sabc.co.za. I have a couple of SMSs for you, Erica. Let me read them and see if I can get responses from you. Here's one. It says, is the problem with the salt itself or the iodine in the salt? There are healthy chemical-free salt like the Himalayan salt and uniodidated sea salt. That's one. Secondly, from Peter, what about biltong? There's also another one from Tabo that says, I concur with your guest. People pour excessive salt on food and distort pristine taste of the food. Sajin Ndenze also says, I used to eat too much salt and salty food. Fortunately, now I have stopped eating salty food because it is dangerous. Here's one, perhaps you can just give us a straightforward answer here. It comes from Stephen in Durban, who says, please ask your guest, how much is 5 grams of salt to a layman? How much can it be measured, or how can it be measured? That's from Steve in Durban. Erica?
Okay, a very general measure in terms of salt, well, 5 grams of salt is basically just under a teaspoon of salt. And that's a little bit difficult to quantify in terms of your daily intake. The studies, South African studies, have looked at where the salt is coming from in our diets, and more than 60% is coming from processed foods. So basically more than half of that, more than half a teaspoon is actually coming from processed salt. So one would then need to be careful of adding the salt in your cooking and at the table as well. So in general, it just under a teaspoon of salt is equal to 5 grams.
Himalayan salt and the uniodidated sea salt?
Yeah, the thing with the uniodidated sea salt is that iodidated salt does provide your body with iodine, which is necessary to prevent conditions like goiter and mental retardation and those kinds of things. But if we're looking at an intake of a teaspoon of salt a day, you're basically going to be getting enough iodine because most of the salt that we eat is iodidated. Uniodidated salt, like the Himalayan salt, it's not going to provide you with the iodine. So the general recommendation is to rather choose the regular salt that you get in the shops, which is iodidated.
All right. I need to go to the newsroom now because it is 8:30. But again, when we come back, Kasinbe is one of the people holding for me on the line. Also, a number of emails have come through here. gwalax@sabc.co.za, 34701, the text message line. It'll cost you R2, but also you can give me a call, 0891 14208. It is 8:30. Let's say once again a very good morning to Asanda Matsaunyane. Well, for now, though, we're talking salt. And the reason why we're doing so, if you've just joined us, is because the Department of Health wants us South Africans to reduce by half our salt intake. They say they would like to get us to meet the WHO target of eating just about 5 grams of salt a day. And we would like them to hear your thoughts on this matter. Let's just go straight to the line. Some of the callers have been on the line for a while. Let's start with Kasinbe. Is it Kasinbe in Matatiele in the Eastern Cape? Hello.
Hello, good morning, Kolani. Good morning.
Welcome. Thank you very much, Kasinbe.
Thank you. Yes, it's very interesting that you're talking about salt content today. To give you an idea, in South Africa, an average South African will take around 9 grams of salt a day, which is quite above the threshold of World Health Organization. And in a country where we are under nutrition transition, meaning we're no longer eating the way we used to eat 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Now we're having this Western diet, which is highly processed, and we have a high burden of obesity, so much a high percentage of hypertension. So a patient will be taking the hypertension medication, and you give them a dietary guideline to make sure that they're taking less salt in their food, but still because the salt content in the food they buy is so high, it doesn't help in their hypertension treatment, and they end up even congestive cardiac failure quicker. And therefore it increases also the health cost. So it's important that the Department of Health yet do that we call public intervention, which is a long-term measure to make sure that through labeling, people can know how much salt it is, and to know that there's what we call a deadly sin of salt. So salt itself also is important for your body in terms of the osmosis as part of other electrolyte, but being it taken in excess can actually increase your water retention in the body, in the heart a bit, and also worsen your hypertension or any other chronic disease that you're having. So maybe salt itself is not the major cause of hypertension, because obesity is actually maybe playing a major role there, but salt will end up worsening actually the lifestyle of this of any individual. So it's important, yes, that the government and the Department of Health, as a custodian of health, really do that public intervention, because we've seen that the labeling alone are not correct. It should be a serious warning, And by the way, when you take around 5 grams of salt, you should be having enough iodine. So the salt is got enough iodine. But the main thing is the salt content is quite too high in the food that we buy.
All right.
And that's why actually they pay to use a measure to say, okay, let us do the counseling for individuals. Yes. But the food that they buy got so much content of salt, such as bread, all these processed meat, the Vienna, the polony. You can't even quantify how much it is inside.
All
so
right.
yes, I agree and I support that very much. And I think it's a dangerous. I heard you talked about email from Cape Town. Someone saying that if you have low blood pressure, it's better to take some salt. That's very dangerous.
All right, Kasinbe.
You could end up drinking too much water and take the whole salt out of your body, which is fatal as well.
All right, Kasinbe in Matatiele, thank you very much. A lot of facts coming through from him. Again, I'll test that against my guests. Is it Wittert in Cape Town? Hello.
Yes, good morning, Shalani, and good morning to the professor and your listeners. It's Ed Wittert here.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you. Look, I'd like to echo the sentiments of the previous caller, and that by almost like passive smoking, the food that we buy in the shops and that's presented to us has inherited it in its manufacture. For example, I've been reading recently in the press about the brine content of imported chickens that are exported maybe from South America, and that the norm is about 12%. That's the universal expectation, whereas ours, when it arrives, is maybe twice as much as that. And I really believe that, the external ways of preventing, or governmental state ways of preventing us from receiving food like this, by certain controls being implemented by them, so that it will make the man in the street, such as myself as a pensioner, make our task easier to do our little part and also help.
All right, Wittert in Cape Town, I thank you. I'll take more calls, 0891 104 208, 0891 104 208. Let me read some emails as well. There's one from Denzel Harper in Port Elizabeth who says, sugar and salt are the real spices in foods, especially processed foods of all sorts. Legislation to reduce these salt and sugar amounts in processed foods has come to come to the fore. Babies are introduced to these foods practically out of the womb. This on its own should have alarm bells ringing in powers that be. Those punting processed foods are sickening their own people, friends, and families over time. That's Denzel Harper in Port Elizabeth. David Sanders also, an SMS. I beg your pardon, an email. David Sanders is Emeritus Professor, School of Public Health at the University of the Western Cape. He's written to us this morning. He says, with reference to the current program, find the article published in this month's International Journal. I'll just open it and perhaps read the first paragraph for you. It talks about big food, the consumer food environment, health, and the policy response in South Africa. In South Africa and in other jurisdictions, big food, large commercial entities that dominate the food and beverage environment is becoming more widespread and is implicated in unhealthy eating. Small food remains significant in the food environment in South Africa, and it is both linked with and threatened by big food. Right, well, it'll be nice to hear from Professor, Emeritus Professor, if you can call us, 0891 104 208. Tell us a little bit about the article that you've just sent me now. Some SMSs from Selma. Can the panel comment on, is it celery salt as substitute for salt? Are smoked foods bad? Do you want to comment on that for me, if you may, Erica?
Yeah, the various herbal salts and vegetable salts, things like the garlic and the celery, they are generally high in salt, and it's combined with very small amounts of dried herbs or vegetables. So, it's not one of the things that we would actually recommend that you take to try to reduce your salt. I think one should try to avoid all of those salty seasonings, including the vegetable salts. And to use natural things to flavor foods, things like lemon juice. There's plenty of herbs that one can use to flavor your foods.
Sure. There's another SMS here, and perhaps, Professor, this one is for you. Somebody says, I read once that sea salt was safer. Did I misunderstand the author? That's stay in KZN. Oh, actually, somebody was saying a little earlier on that it makes you mad.
No, with sea salt, rock salt, table salt, kosher salt, they basically all the same thing, and they're equally high in sodium. So, all of those types of things one should really try to avoid.
Right. Let me go again to Trust in Mokopane on the line. Trust, good morning.
Good morning, Colin. How are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for your call.
I'm fine, thanks. Look, my view is basically that I think as a country we need to have some strict regulation in terms of the amount of salt that is put into the processed foods. I'm a hypertension patient for the past 10 years now, and I've been trying to get my wife to reduce salt intake in the house, but it's obviously not working. Because at the end of the day, I'm the only one who wants food that doesn't have salt, and yet everyone around me wants food with salt. So if we can regulate that and ensure that at least the processed food has as little salt as possible, I think that would work.
Prof, please respond to Trust here, but also Kazimbe a little earlier on touched on matters of labeling. The problem with labeling is that sometimes it is inaccurate. How do we make sure that we've got correct labeling and that it is well monitored? Professor?
Well, let me just say that I'm absolutely delighted by all the callers that have called in, and the emails and the SMSs and so on, because it seems to me that the public is really behind us in reducing salt content. And I think your last caller is correct, that people who are already suffering from heart disease or hypertension or whatever, they don't really have an option at all as to how to reduce their salt, even if they want to, because of the high content in the food. And although he says, well, his family can put more salt in themselves, which I agree with, and we discourage that, but he's saying, well, I don't actually have an option, and he's right. So we do need to reduce the salt in food. Maybe just before getting to some of the questions that you raised, I think people have been a little bit curious about which foods we are going to be targeting.
Yeah.
Because we looked at which foods contain the most salt in terms of the population consumption in South Africa. Because it wasn't easy for us to say, well, we're going to regulate all foods, because all foods have different content, and to bring it down to the amount that we need, it would be very difficult for us. So we looked, as I say, at which foods have the highest salt that are consumed. And the highest amongst those, perhaps surprisingly to some of your listeners, is bread. It's probably about 40% of the salt that you take, Xolani, is from bread, is from the salt that's put in bread. Okay,
that's amazing, because a lot of us eat bread almost every day, and it's a staple for some people.
Absolutely. That's why the content that you take in of bread is so high. It might not necessarily be that much salt in the bread, but it's the amount of bread that you eat as a staple. That adds up then to it being the highest reason for the population to be taking in high salt. Okay, so breads are the first one. The second one is breakfast cereals. The third one is fats and butter spreads. Then you have your savory snacks and chips and so on. And then people have also been talking about processed meats, your polonies and so on. And then the soups and gravy powders and the stocks and so on that people put a lot into their cooking. That also contains a lot of salt. So we're just going to target those foods.
All right.
And just by doing that, we think we're going to be able to substantially reduce the salt content. There has, in terms of the labeling thing, there has been some suggestion that we put a label of high salt onto certain foodstuffs that are not part of this group. For example, also people brought up the issue of biltong. Now, yes, biltong or something like soy sauce is very, very high in salt, and we will be discouraging people from eating excessive amounts of that. But in terms of the amount of biltong or soy sauce that our population consumes, it's not one of the major categories that lead to us having high salt content in our bodies and leading to the hypertension. So we could put high salt onto those so that people are aware that when they're eating them, they are taking in high salt. And this is something that we're considering quite carefully.
Here's an email for you, Precious. It says, can you ask your guest about the spices, because they are just salt. We use them a lot at Shisanyama. Says the email, Reggie Mkhize.
Yeah, I mean, the spices, they've got as much salt or sodium as just the table salt. They're just there to add flavor, because obviously they've got spices which help, for the food to taste better. Otherwise, they're just as salty. You can't substitute like food for a salty spice. It's one and the same thing.
I suppose part of your advice to Reggie may very well be that stay away from Shisanyama.
Yes, of course. One day, a week free. What is it? My campaign. The one I'm running, where I'm encouraging people to have just one day a week where they don't eat meat. Yeah, that means like stay away from Shisanyama. Definitely.
Yeah, but I mean, there are people who almost live there literally every day, go to Shisanyama.
Yeah, but this is where the department should be coming in to say, I mean, people can eat less salt, but if they eat Shisanyama, where they fry meat every day, I have ladies. I didn't think ladies would eat as much meat. I mean, at work, I observe them. They would eat meat at breakfast, lunch, and supper 3 times a day, like ladies. I say, I mean, at least once a day. And, I mean, each time you have that meat, you always have, like, extra salt,
But why should we not eat meat? I mean, what's wrong with meat?
No, other than it being, meat, before it used to be healthy. Now it is farmed. So anything that involves farming, it means you add certain things to get certain outcomes. For example, a chicken, it takes about 6 weeks to get to the stage where you slaughter it. I mean, just imagine if you had your own chick at home. In 6 weeks, will it have grown to that full size? What makes it grow so quickly? It's the antibiotics and hormones, and all that goes back into what you eat, and it affects you negatively. So it's not just salt; it's a lot of things. It's like a glass of milk. I would not say protein. Yeah, no, we'll get to protein. Like a glass of milk. The one I have in my house, but it's there. I don't use it. I don't know why I bought it. It says per 100 ml, it has about 48 milligrams of sodium. You see, if you do like a direct conversion, it's like 48%. You would find, in milk, 48% of salt is found in milk. And when you drink milk, it doesn't taste like it's got salt in it. You see, so the problem is a lot bigger. It's like your soda. Because what contributes to the hypertension, it's not just it's not the sodium chloride, it's the sodium, and sodium is available in so many forms, like other preservatives, like sodium benzoate. You see, that sodium is used in cold drinks, in a lot of things. You'll be drinking a cappuccino or a can of your soda. You think you're drinking something sugary, but it's laden with salt. So salt is everywhere. But when you look at the source, it's all the foods that people shouldn't be eating anyway. So when you educate the public, you educate them. Regulating versus education. Education is more, because if you regulate to say, okay, decrease the salt in content in your foods, people are gonna buy these things. But when they eat them, they're gonna taste funny. So what they do, they shift into using more table salt. So it's like if you just remove like 2 slices of bread, to give you the figures, has about 500 milligrams of salt, which is like half a gram in 2 slices of bread. And some people will have about 4 slices of bread a day. That's like 1 gram already, just from bread. So if you eat your usual sandwich and it's got it doesn't taste the way, you can see the salt is missing here. What are you going to do? You're just going to add more something to get that original taste that you know. So even the people, like the last call, I think it was Trust, he said like he wants to have this low salt diet, but at home they don't. If the whole family understood why it's important to have a healthy meal. It's not the fact that their blood pressure is still normal. If they continue eating as much salt as they do, sooner or later they will catch up with Trust, and then everyone would have the same hypertension problem, something that could have been prevented simply by educating the public.
All right. Let me take some calls here. Somebody says the celebrity chefs on television are always encouraging seasoning and stressing the need for salt to enhance the food. What about cheese, for instance? But let me take some calls here. There is Professor Sanders who sent us that email a little earlier on. Professor, good morning. Thank you for calling us.
Good morning, Koldani, and your guest.
Thanks indeed.
I agree strongly with Professor Freeman that there should be regulation of salt content in people's food, and that people will gradually get used to this. I think it's unfortunate that Precious is opposing this kind of move by education. Obviously, education is necessary. But the fact of the matter is that our food environment is extremely unregulated. So I referred a bit earlier to this article which we had published. So just to give you a couple of statistics, over the last 5 years, well, between 2005 and 2010, the volume of sales, for example, of ready meals, which are full of salt and other unhealthy products, went up 43%. Of snack bars went up 43%. Of noodles, which have got lots of salt in them, these instant noodles, went up by 45%. So why is this happening? It's happening because our food environment has changed very dramatically in the last 15 years or so, and we have figures to show this. and that processed foods now occupy about 70% of shelf space in supermarkets, and even in rural areas, people are purchasing from supermarkets. Now, people aren't stupid. They're purchasing these foods because they are cheaper. So you can educate people all you want, but if you don't change the kinds of price incentives, then there will be problems. Of course, people should be educated, but it's a little bit more complex than that, and I think that Professor Freeman agrees with me, that you need to regulate the food environment. Starting with salt's a good idea, but we need also to regulate the costs of food. So cheaper, healthy foods need to be subsidized, and unhealthy foods need to be taxed. And government, not the Ministry of Health particularly, but trade, for example, and industry, need to make moves in this direction. Otherwise, our problems of obesity, high blood pressure, heart disease, and so on will continue to rise.
Fabulous point. I really appreciate your call. Professor David Sanders, I'm going to ask my guests then to give me their opinions, especially about the point where you say that the unhealthy foods must be made expensive, healthy food must be subsidized. What do people think about that? But let me take a commercial break. I'll come back and take more calls and also get views.
The Forum at 8 with Xolani Gwala.
Let me quickly go to John in Sandton. Hello, John.
Good morning, Xolani.
Hi.
Good morning to the panelists, and
Welcome.
good morning to the listeners.
Yeah.
Xolani, I just feel that, with the exception of Precious, the other panelists have got it totally wrong. Salt is getting an unfair rap. It is not the killer that it is. It's added for taste. The killer are the sodium preservatives. And what I find very surprising is that in during this entire conversation, the big killer, monosodium glutamate, or MSG, has not been exposed to the evil that it is. I'd like to hear your panelists' view on this.
All right, John, thank you very much. Professor, let me start with you. How do you respond to John, but also touch on what Professor Sanders said?
Yeah. Look, MSG is not nearly as dangerous to health as sodium is. And it's the sodium in sodium chloride or salt, which is the big danger. And we could give figures around that, but just to say that it's not MSG that's the big problem, it is salt or sodium. In terms of Professor Sanders, look, the Department of Health has recently completed a strategy for reducing NCDs, and it's got about 20 points in it that we need to address. And salt is only one of them. And the others touch on things like the availability of good food as opposed to bad food and so on. And one of our strategies is to engage with other government departments such as trade and industry and agriculture and so on to see how we are going to ensure that we get healthy food to the public. And the kinds of ideas that he's been talking about are on the cards. I can't say that we're going to tax unhealthy foods at this point in time, but we are thinking about those kinds of strategies, and we are engaging with other departments around this. So don't expect this to be the last on healthy lifestyle.
All right. Let me get a last comment as well from Erica.
Yeah, just in terms of the sodium and the MSG, if one looks at the composition of sodium chloride, 40% of sodium chloride or salt is actually sodium. So I certainly agree that the majority of our intake of sodium actually comes from salt, not from all the other preservatives like the MSG and things like your cool drinks, the sodium benzoate and things like that. And the other thing about Prof. Sanders, if in future there could be some kind of a taxation like sin taxes, similar to what we have on tobacco and alcohol, I certainly think that would help to reduce the intake of unhealthy food.
All right. Precious, closing remarks, please.
Yeah, and just to respond to what Professor Sanders was saying, I'm not actually arguing. I don't eat salt. I eat like below 4 grams of salt, a day. But for someone who doesn't know what salt is, because sodium could be anything. And the figures, if you take just a can of anything, it's listed there to tell you how much salt is. So it doesn't necessarily to be sodium chloride. And for he's rightly saying the food industry is not regulated. So how at this time government is going to get it right by trusting the industry that they are actually going to comply with reducing the salt in their food. So where are they going to get these inspectors to go around if they fail to just do the most basic things like check like animal farming and other agricultural goods? And for what I support, making healthy foods cheaper and taxing them. I mean, I've been calling for that for quite some time, and I'm hoping that government can do something about that, quite soon rather than later.
It's an ongoing discussion. It's an ongoing debate. We're going to have to pick it up or pick up on it in the near future. But for now, let's wrap it up. I thank Professor Melvin Freeman, Chief Director for Non-Communicable Diseases at the Department of Health. Also here with me in studio, Precious Ngayana, Independent Pharmacist and Wellness Campaigner. On the line, also Erica Ketterer, Head of the Research and Program Development at the Heart and Stroke Foundation. Thank you all for coming through. And I would like to thank the team as well who put it all together. Mabubuluga, Colin Lemawana, Misha Shandlale, and Wisani Makubela. Those are our producers. Mark Prela, Technical Producer today. Senior Producer, Chiliti Chibase. Forum at 8, Producer Jake Mugoma, Chief Producer Budzi Lukoto, Executive Producers Busi Chane and Oprah Sechia. Olanugwala, back again on Monday. You have a fantastic weekend. Morning Talk on your radio now between 9 and 12. Cheers. Between 9 and 12. Cheers. Between 9 and 12. Cheers. Between 9 and 12. Cheers.